Yeah, absolutely. And the team that is their biggest competitor for the Bundesliga title, if Leverkusen do want to defend it, is Bayern Munich, and they played against Stuttgart, and this is the game that we want to really deep dive into next. A 4-0 win. Um, I said tongue in cheek, we'll never know if this was going to be a 4-0 win because of the third goal that Bayern Munich scored, where Leroy Sané, I thought was clearly offside. I still don't quite understand the reasoning. I think that the refereeing team felt it was a different set of play. But, you need to see that. I personally think the referees need to see that live. I have to point out, too, that Bayern Munich were up 2-0 at that point against Stuttgart, but we also know that every time someone scores against Bayern when they're only up 2 goals, that in recent weeks, at least, it felt like there was still something there for the taking. We won't find out. But, also, and I think this is really, really, really important. If you're Bayern Munich, Harry Kane scores a hat-trick. He hasn't been at his best lately. The 3 goals there will really help him propel forward, I think. I think, too, it was, especially after they scored the first, a very convincing Bayern Munich performance overall. Against the Stuttgart side that we need to talk about as well, really seemed, especially after that first goal, seemed really tired and exhausted. You can really tell that all the games are kind of catching up to them. And I'm not just on a club level, but also they are the spine of the German national team at the moment, right? They have the most players of any club at the German national team. And I think, these extra games, the extra 4 games that Germany's already played and this season, I think really is a big factor here. Bayern Munich do lose Alexander Pavlovic to a serious shoulder injury. He had an operation, I think, already yesterday, and will be out for several months. I think on balance, though, Stefan, a very good night for Bayern Munich. Going into this game, 3 games without a win. You made that joke last week about, society can only survive once people had missed 3 meals. Society seems to fall apart. That's the same with Bayern Munich. If they didn't win for 3 games, things can really quickly fall apart. I think they got well fed this weekend, so it should be all good for them. But on balance, I think a very good win by Bayern Munich. The offside goal aside, I think this was well deserved.
Yeah, it kind of followed a kind of similar path to the Leverkusen game, I thought, where it started very slow, very tight. Definitely involved some bizarre refereeing decisions. I completely agree with you that the third goal shouldn't have counted because Sané was offside. So for anyone who missed it, basically a cross came into the box. Sané offside, picks it up. I think he lays it back to a player, so it's still in play. The ball then goes around the final third for another 60 seconds and then eventually ends up in the back of the net through what would have been the second attacking play. But as we said in the group chat, why didn't the linesman make that call in the first place? It's all, and this is an issue that we've talked about with VR, and I completely agree with you. There's no point kind of going another rant about VR, so I won't. But at times we do kind of feel like they get the impression that referees are, instead of reacting in real time to instances and making calls, they're just relying on VAR to remind them of something that didn't happen. So if a linesman sees something and think, that's probably offside, it feels as if they're waiting for VAR to say that player was offside 60 seconds later. And in this instance, the linesman didn't make the call. And then because the play went on for another 60 or 90 seconds and then Bayern score, when everyone turns to VAR to say, why didn't you call that? I think their argument was, well, it was too far down the line after the offside call was too far down the line after the goal. So it's basically a situation where no one's picking up. They're both VAR and the linesman are expecting the other one to pick that up, and neither of them really did. So it's a work in progress, to put it politely. But yeah, to go back to the actual football, I completely agree with you. I mean, I did kind of wonder, because Jamie Levlin was the one that I was keeping an eye on in this game, because he obviously did so well for the German national team. And you did kind of really think that he would go into this game just full of energy, full of excitement, full of pride, thinking, oh my God, I'm a German national team, scored against the Netherlands. I'm ready to take on the world. And to be honest, it was the complete opposite. He looked absolutely exhausted. He looks jaded. And it's not just a case of maybe him being physically jaded. It's maybe also a case of him being emotionally jaded. These guys have such a high of playing for the national team that they then come back down to earth on a Saturday, and they just don't have the energy to do it again. In what is typically the biggest game of the Bundesliga season for these players when they come to the Bayern, not the Bayern Arena, the Allianz Arena, and have to try and do their very best against Bayern Munich in front of their own fans. He looked exhausted. I thought Dennis Undav looked exhausted. Angelo Stiller looked really tired. That back line, as we discussed in the chat, of Chabot and Raut, I believe it is, they look really inexperienced. They both of them look very raw. They both look like players who, will develop into outstanding players one day. But the fact that it's both of them at the same time having to learn their trade at the same time, it's a tricky situation for Stuttgart. You can see how different things would be if there was an Ito or a Valdemar Anton in there instead of one of them, and then both of them are getting game time with this kind of elder statesman alongside them. Because at times Bayern Munich counterattacked, and it was very quickly 4-on-2, and it would be because one of those two central defenders had ran off to chase a forward who had intentionally pulled him out of place. Harry Kane typically being that player because he likes to drop deep so far. So I thought Bayern Munich had a lot of success with that. And equally on the other side of the pitch, I just don't think Stuttgart's attack really up to much. I really expect a lot more from Dennis Undav in this game, and we just didn't get anything from him. He looked tired. To give Bayern's central defenders credit, which we haven't really done much this season, I thought Kim Min-jae did a really good job there. I thought Upamecano did a decent job as well. Both of them maybe didn't have the most energetic or most dynamic players to play against in this game, but they both did a really good job of it. And after a pretty tired first half, or a slow first half, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think at half time, Bayern's XG was 0.35 and Stuttgart's was 0.14. So it just goes to show how little actually happened in the game, which definitely makes sense. Then all of a sudden, Harry Kane does what he does and just kind of comes to life and makes something out of nothing with some remarkable skill and tremendous finishing. And I think it was, outstanding kind of individual talent, but I think it was also you could see it was such a kind of weight off his shoulders that he got back. Yeah. He was finally scoring again. The same actually could be said of Kingsley Coman, who his celebration for that fourth goal was very kind of emotional. He just kind of screamed into the night sky. You could see he was saying, "Oh my God, I'm finally back in the goals." Where, because he's obviously had a very kind of rough time of it at Bayern Munich recently. But I thought Bayern were more or less spot on in this game. Maybe if Stuttgart were fully fit, maybe if the spine of the team wasn't exhausted from playing for Germany, we might have had a more intense and a more interesting match. But I think eventually it was a game that Bayern Munich were able to quite comfortably pick Stuttgart off in the second half.
Yeah, I mean, Dennis Undav missed he was on the bench for the Netherlands game with an injury, right? So you wonder if that still carried into this match, because I thought it was quite striking how Stuttgart just tried to play long balls out of the back and straight to their strikers, whether it was Undav or someone else. And then they tried to then quickly turn Kim or Upamecano around. And it's just, there was moments in the first half where I thought Stuttgart is really only one ball through away from scoring a goal, but it just didn't happen. And maybe it's because the fitness with Undav in particular just wasn't there. That last little bit of mental and physical awareness that you need in matches like that, it just seemed off. That final ball that you really needed and has hurt Bayern Munich so much already this season, just wasn't able to be played there. And some of it is credit where credit due. I think Bayern Munich's defense did do a really good job there to kind of contain that, but you also could kind of just sense that there was a game plan that Sebastian Hoeneß followed, and it was to put the balls quickly forward and play it on Undav and then hope that they would turn around the defense. And it just wasn't there for them in this match. And I'm in complete agreement with you and the defense. I think that Chabot and Noah are defenders of the highest quality in maybe half a year, especially in the system. But there's no Sebastian Hoeneß doesn't have a choice, right? He has to work with these guys and he has to integrate them into the system and he has to give them time. He has to teach them how to play his type of football, which isn't the easiest type of football to play. It took the likes of Ito and Waldemar Anton some time as well to figure it out before they moved on to bigger clubs. And I think that is something that is going on here. And I really need to stress this. I wrote an article about this while I was at the Super Cup, right? And talked to a bunch of people at Stuttgart. They themselves said this 100 times. Goal this season is to finish top 9. There's no illusion here of them saying we're going to be in the Champions League again. I personally think they're going to finish in a European place. That's where I have them. That could be top 6 or top 7, depending on how things go. But, they themselves are making this point too, that they're saying, look, we were able to add some really good players, but we also lost some really good players, and this is going to take time, and the season is going to be a little bit of let's conserve what we achieved last year, make sure that we still play a really good role in the Bundesliga, but don't expect the sky from us. And I think that's where they're at. They're still a really good team. And I think in about 6 months' time, they're going to be a very good team again. But right now, you see at times that they're a really good team with a lot of talent, but you also see at times that, this game was actually a perfect example of it. For the first 50, 60 minutes or so, you had the sense that they could go toe-to-toe with Bayern Munich, and then they didn't. It just there wasn't enough of it there. And you saw it against Real Madrid for a little bit too. I think too, Nübel conceding 2 goals now from a long range, that's something that he needs to work on. That goal by Harry Kane to open the scoring looked a lot like that third goal by Real Madrid. He gets, I think, a complete hand on it, Stefan, and I think as a goalkeeper, you just need to do a tiny bit better there. I do think that's a learnable skill, so that is something that he can work on and probably will be working on, but you just see it, there's tiny things right now. Stuttgart are maybe at 70 to 80%, and that's just, that it's not going to be enough to replicate what they did last year.
Yeah. And, that's largely down to just the players they lost. And this is always going to be a natural reaction to that.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the way Stuttgart have been for a long time. It's how they've been before Sebastian Hoeneß joined the club, where there would be a constant turnover of players. I actually wrote an article a few years ago saying, what's the point of Stuttgart? That was the title of the article, because they kept getting themselves into this relegation problem because they kept selling their best players and they kept signing more young players, and you kind of thought, well, what are they actually building towards here if they're just going to lose half their squad every summer? And I think they did their best to keep a lot of these players. Obviously, Sebastian Hoeneß wants to build something. I think Ito was expected. I think Anton was still quite a surprise to a lot of fans and the club itself that he decided to move on to Dortmund, who I think a lot of people would argue have a lesser team or fewer or smaller or harsher prospects of doing better than Stuttgart this season. Of course, they are probably doing better, I'm telling you right now. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a transition season for Stuttgart. They'll be happy to finish the top half of the season. And even if they were saying we want to finish top 4 and being that ambitious, I don't really think away games at the Allianz Arena are the kind of matches that will define how well they do. I think the things that keep Sebastian Hoeneß up at night aren't defeats to Bayern in Munich. It's probably 1-1 draws with Hoffenheim or 2-2 draws with Wolfsburg, or defeats to Freiburg, or 3-3 draws with Mainz. They've already played quite a few pretty rubbish teams in the Bundesliga this season and dropped points to them, but can somehow still turn it on when they come up against the likes of Dortmund or Gladbach, who I think are probably obviously much better than the teams I mentioned there. So if I was Stuttgart and, if I was Sebastian Hoeneß, I wouldn't be too disheartened by this result. I'm sure he's not, but they've then got coming up, they've got Holstein Kiel, Leverkusen, Frankfurt, Bochum, Bremen, Union Berlin, and Heidenheim, and then St. Pauli to finish up the year. And aside from the Leverkusen and Frankfurt games, those are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 very winnable games for them. I think Union Berlin, very difficult, although it's at home. Heidenheim away is probably quite tricky as well, but these games are the ones that they have to start picking up maximum points, and no one's going to begrudge them losing to Bayern away or Leverkusen away. It's when they start dropping points to Holstein Kiel, your Bochums, your Werder Bremens, that's when the alarm bells start ringing, or that's when a transition season suddenly turns into a dreadful season. You know, we've seen that in recent years. Union Berlin's a good example of that, where too much transition can very quickly turn into disaster. I don't think Stuttgart are there by any means, and I think Sebastian Hoeneß is a very good head coach, but I want to see far more consistency from Stuttgart against these mid-table teams, these bottom half-table teams. That would be my concern, rather than, you know, not showing up against Bayern Munich on Saturday.
And they did lose that game last year too, and at the Allianz, right? They did then turn it around at Bayern. I was at that game in Stuttgart. They beat Bayern in Stuttgart towards the end of the season, who eventually did get that second spot in the Bundesliga, which, you know, historic and all that kind of stuff. But I think that needs to be pointed out that towards the start of last year, they didn't have the perfect record either, right? So we could very well sit here in 3 or 4 months' time and Stuttgart have won 5 and 6 games in a row, and I'm like, oh yeah, well, here they are. You know, Hoeneß has figured it out and put the pieces back together, and maybe they had a stretch where the national team didn't take half their team and put them in action midweek. So, you know, I think the jury is still out here. And for Bayern Munich, I think that this is an excellent result. I think the only thing that we need to watch a little bit is the whole Palhinha situation, who's now, of course, going to play a lot of games with Pavlovic out, Stefan, and then I thought he looked really slow in this match.
Well, do you know what? I think this could really be the making of Palhinha, to be honest with you. I didn't think he was that bad. I do agree that he kind of got caught in possession a few times. I think that's understandable. He obviously hasn't played a lot of football, but he's really been thrown in the thick of it now, or the deep end, or whatever you want to use, because they then, of course, have Barcelona away now in the Champions League. And he's not only stepping in for any old player, he's stepping in for Pavlovic, the boy wonder from the Munich Academy, who's been one of Bayern's most consistent players over the course of 2024, not just to start the season. So he'll have it really up against him. But, you know, it's moments like this in careers that can define a player's spell at a club. He's obviously had to wait patiently to get his chance at Bayern Munich. He was signed off the back of a recommendation from the previous head coach, as you said in the chat this weekend, probably signed back then anyway. There's probably agreement that was made, you know, this time last year. So it had nothing to do with Vincent Kompany, which makes perfect sense, and Vincent Kompany has more or less ignored him from his starting 11 since he made the move to Munich. But he's been forced to play him now because Pavlovic now obviously has the shoulder injury that's going to rule him out for some time. So I'll hold my reservations on him until we see him against Barcelona, because I think that game's maybe better suited for him, where he is a defensive player first and foremost, who is at his best when he's in the thick of it, breaking down counter-attacks, which Barcelona will undoubtedly throw at Bayern Munich with everything they've got. So I think it actually sets up quite interestingly to see how he does in that game, because it's exactly what they signed him for. These big Champions League games against good teams with good attacking players, he's there to be that defensive player that they've not really had since Javi Martinez, if you want to go all the way back there. So let's see how he does. He might do really well, and all of a sudden that transfer fee makes perfect sense. And then, interestingly enough, it'll then presumably his position until he loses it, and then Pavlovic will also have to come back from injury and fight for it all over again. But Vincent Kompany would be very, very happy to have 2 quality players fighting for that position.
Yeah, I mean, injuries happen, right? Who knows what the situation is where by the time Pavlovic comes back. I hope he recovers quickly, because, you know, he's been outstanding, and maybe in some ways Bayern Munich's most important player.